Guests on the interview show all share one thing in common. They take risks. We'd like to thank Lifeway, makers of probiotic kefir, for making possible this week's It Takes Guts interview.
Next up is a writer who is a co-creator of the new show for HBO called Brown Girls. We talked with her at the bar. Here is Fatimah Asghar. So Brown Girls, the first thing I want to say about it, right off the bat, is that it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there's a lot of conflict and strife and struggle of people in their 20s trying to make their way. And it's also against the backdrop of people, mostly women, who are Black or Muslim, or gay, people who traditionally they're not in the corridors of power. They're often shut out. Maybe I'm wrong, but at the end of the day, I came away feeling like this is about friendship, and friendship is the most fun thing in the world.
Yeah. I mean, that was like the whole point of the show, was to really zone in on this like intimate friendship between these two women, and to kind of like build that out a little bit. And I think like you're right, like a lot of it wanted to rest in this place of joy and like happiness and like fun to me. And I think in particular, it was just because it was fun to write that way, like to just have these characters who are so messy and just kind of do all this stuff. But even like the conflicts that they have are real and they're really important, but like it is a lot of their friendship that kind of gets them out of that, or like makes them able to kind of deal with those conflicts, like in terms of like their family struggles or whatever's going on in their love lives or their relationships. And so I just think that the story at its heart is a story about friendship.
So let's talk about the two characters in particular that you've mentioned, the main ones.
Yeah.
Layla and Patricia. And Layla's based on you and Patricia's based on Jamila Woods, is that correct?
Well, it's very loosely based on us, so...
No, I'm not going to play that game where I'm like, and did this happen to you? And did that happen to you? And I can't believe.
But me and, like, what I wanted to convey is, like, yeah, like, identity-wise, that's how it kind of shakes down, is, like, Layla has a lot of my identity traits, Patricia has a lot of Jamila's identity traits, and then trying to think about just wanting to show the kind of intimacy of friendship that me and Jamila have on screen, and feeling like even when, like, there's, like, female friendships in shows I love, sometimes there's, like, a selfishness to them, or they're not, like, they're kind of not always, like, super... like googly-eyed over each other. And like, I think what Layla and Patricia are like very much like starry-eyed and like in love with each other, and like very, very, you know, they are each other's like ride or dies, you know? And I wanted to kind of convey that because I felt like that was such a component of mine and Jamila's relationship. But even when I would watch shows, that had like diverse characters or had women, like strong women roles, it was like usually about one person and not about both of them, or like about like how one is someone's best friend. And I didn't want them to be like each other's best friends. I wanted them to be each other's like, I wanted them to be completely individual people that also were best friends and kind of loved each other.
So let's talk about the shows that you did grow up with, because I imagine, I don't know when exactly you grew up, I don't know how old you are, but you grew up 90s, 2000s, well after I grew up. But my guess is that even then, there weren't a lot of people on TV who looked like you.
Yeah.
And were you acutely aware of that at the time, or did you just feel like some kind of sense of loneliness that you could not describe? Yeah,
I mean, I think that I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, and I feel like there was like a moment of like extreme multiculturalism in casting in the 90s too, which was like really beautiful. Like I remember on like Nickelodeon and Disney, there was a show called like Taina, which was like a show about a Latina girl with her like family. And they had all these debates around like language and like her not like knowing how to speak Spanish fluently, but not being able to write it. And like all of these things that I think are really important. And I loved that show. That was like my favorite show, right? And there was like a lot of different kind of shows like that, like specifically for young people that I kind of gravitated towards, but none of them had Muslim characters or a South Asian character.
Yeah.
And I think I didn't realize, like, it just kind of was the norm, right? Like I was like, oh, I just don't see myself. And like, I didn't think that much of it. Or I thought like when I did see myself, it would be like in kind of relegated. Cause I was in 7th grade when September 11th happened. And it was very much like relegated to being like roles of terrorists or gas station owners or mostly terrorists. But like that was kind of just like the way that I saw South Asian people represented. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, and I don't think I realized what it was doing to my, like, I just felt like, like lonely, like you said. Like I felt like walking around and being very much like, I don't, like there's not a lot of people who look like me in popular media. And that kind of just made me feel like an anomaly, even though like I knew a lot of people who looked like me. And
yeah, I mean, there's billions.
Yeah, totally. and like knowing that and knowing the diversity within that, but not seeing it kind of had this weird like distancing effect.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a tension in that you don't want to make a show that says, this is a show about Muslim people.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, you're still telling a story about specific characters,
right.
but you do want to showcase other parts of life that hasn't been shown before. So how do you negotiate that where you're like, no, at the end of the day, you can put any label you want on the show, but I wanted to make it about real people doing real things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's a really big kind of thing that anytime I'm creating, I'm thinking about, because a lot, like, it's just about thinking about, for me, is about thinking about those characters as real people, right? And so to be able to be like, I know people like this. Like, these characters are like a combination of many, many friends and many people I know. And that gives them, like, not the kind of way that they just subvert into, like, stereotypes of roles or, like, a special episode show where it's like, now we're going to talk about this thing, you know? And I think that it's like, you know, when I wrote the series, the only two races that I specified were Layla's and Patricia's, and everybody else I was like, they can be whatever, but I want to make sure that there's like people of color who are playing these roles, because I just don't think that often people of color get to play nuanced, interesting roles. And that was just like, I think just being able to write a character and then kind of have their race like be important when it is and like not important when it's not. You know, that's like that's how a lot of people walk around the world.
That's life.
Yeah, that's like you're walking and then sometimes you realize like, oh, that my gender like is affecting this thing, or like, oh, my race is, or oh, my class background, my sexuality, whatever. But most of the time you're just kind of walking around and like are probably like hungry and trying to figure out where you're gonna get good food. You know, like I think like there's like so much kind of like basicness that is just like goes into living that I wanted to make sure was conveyed in the series. Like, you know, like Layla plucking Patricia's eyebrows, right? Or like these kind of moments in which like they're just actually just being humans, and they're like Layla walking to the bus stop, or like Patricia kind of like at her job, right? Like these like moments that just make them very human was like really important.
But and yet your identity, anybody's identity, is never, you can never go a day, at least I can't, without thinking of who I am and perhaps how other people perceive me.
Right, totally. And I think that that's so real, right? Is like you can't do that, and that I think that's so interesting because it plays out so differently for everybody. Even like people who like on paper have the same identities, like if you're like this person has the same racial, gender, sexuality, and class background, but they play out very differently. They can play out very differently for those people, and I think that that's like what makes really cool art.
Art can, it's not going to solve everything, but it can add empathy to the conversation.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I mean, you can have friends, you can have relationships with people who occupy all identities, but sometimes you're not always like talking about those like those things, right? But then when you read like a poetry book, right? That I'm thinking specifically about reading this poetry book by an author, Natalie Diaz, called When My Brother Was an Aztec, and she's indigenous, and like thinking about like just reading all of this stuff and like learning about life on like her life on the reservation that she grew up on, and just being really like struck by it and being like, this is really beautiful. And I'm glad that like she wrote this book and that I have like this window into her life, which is maybe something I wouldn't have had otherwise, you know? And I think like that is like, you're right, it creates empathy. It creates like this moment.
Honestly, with watching Brown Girls, like there was so much that I related to. I was in my 20s in Chicago. I went to parties. But there was so much I related to, but there was a lot that I was learning's a weird word when you're being entertained, but there was
or
some
like
of that.
just like being made open to, I think, is like you're all of these kind of themes, like good art touches on a lot of different themes of like human existence, like whether it's loneliness, whether it's like being young and like like going to parties and not knowing what you're doing, whether it's like family tension, whatever the kind of thing is, and like a lot of different people can read themselves into a story, right? Like I've read myself into so many stories. Like I grew up with not seeing like South Asian people in media. I read myself into a lot of stories.
Same with me and Jewish males.
Yeah. No, but really, you know, that kind of feeling of just being like, I don't understand that kind of thing of like, and I think it happens like you see it when like, you know, like a Star Wars or a big movie comes out and they cast like people of color, and then there's like a backlash that's like, but now it's not relatable, and it's like to. What? Like you can't read yourself into something?
Or the Ghostbusters thing?
Yeah.
That was the weirdest controversy of all time.
Yeah. And I think that it's this weird thing that like people, like to kind of only be able to read yourself into characters that look exactly like you is like deeply problematic. Yeah, but it's also really important to have representation of a lot of different people so that like you can see yourself like reflected, right? Like I think that it's a strange tension because it's like both things are equally important, and like when making art, like you can't lose sight of either of those things.